A cartoon in the Oregonian a few months ago featured a mom saying to her son, "You flunked your last history test? Nate!" And her son responding, "That test was so unfair. How am I supposed to remember stuff that happened before I was even born?" American historians find Nate's response completely unsurprising and often lament how little Americans really know about our history. But it is important that history not be forgotten. Not because, or just because, we're doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past if we can't remember them, but because we're unlikely to appreciate the significance of what we're doing today if we fail to understand what shaped us. I'm going to start with a question. Most of us here, I think, identify or partly identify as Americans. I want to ask you to take a few seconds to think about what it is that you're proudest of about being an American. Just jot down or maybe remember the first 2 or 3 things that come to your mind. What are you proudest of about being an American? Okay, I asked this question of students in an American history class I taught and the students in several nonprofit law classes. I'd like to compare their answers with yours. How many people name something related to our form of government? Democracy, individual rights, our Constitution, freedom, equality, our system of law? Okay, most of us. Yeah. How many people name something related to our economy? Free markets, prosperity, the American dream? Might be a good time to ask that right now. How many name something else? Okay, oh, several people, okay. Well, like so many of you, most of us seem to rate the positive aspects of our identity as Americans in features of our government, or maybe our economy, which is what students in all of my classes did. Some people might list cultural traits such as individualism or diversity. Very few of us think that being American means that we're a public-minded people who want to help our world. When we tell our history, we largely overlook the remarkable role that nonprofit associations and the people in them have played in American life, doing just that. So today, I hope to persuade you to rethink your American identity. I invite you to consider that an important aspect of who we are as Americans is our drive to improve our worlds, something each of you is doing by virtue of your connection with a nonprofit entity. Voluntary associations, which is an older term for nonprofit organizations, have been important to American life since the American Revolution and before. As the tensions with Great Britain that led to the American Revolution heated up, colonial men formed themselves in voluntary associations called the Sons of Liberty, or committees of correspondence, or in the backcountry, regulators to protest and organize against the British. After the Revolution, voluntary associations proliferated throughout the states. Visiting America in 1832, Frenchman and outside observer Alexis de Tocqueville commented on the startling role that nonprofit associations played in American life as contrasted with France and England. He said, "Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all dispositions constantly form associations. Americans make associations to give entertainments, to construct churches, to diffuse books. Wherever at the head of some new undertaking, you see the government in France, or a man of rank in England. In the United States, you will be sure to find an association." Well, de Tocqueville was correct that Americans constantly form associations. Both in the 19th century and since, voluntary associations have been essential to every major social movement and reform in this country, including the abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, unionism, numerous civil rights movements, the conservation and environmental movements, and immigrant integration into American life. But as the Barkers at the Oregon State Fair say, there's more. In addition to promoting reform, nonprofit organizations operated charities and offered arts and culture, social venues, and places to worship. Nonprofit foundations such as NAO members, Meyer Memorial Trust, the Collins Foundation, and Spirit Mountain Community Foundation, among others, have provided billions of dollars in grants to support the work of other nonprofits. And there's still more. Nonprofits have been and are a lifeline for marginalized groups. Racial and ethnic groups, Native Americans, immigrants, women, and sexual minorities who were fenced out of the political process created and still create nonprofit associations to nurture community, marshal resources, and exercise power. Now look at what I'm talking to. You know this. You live this. Nonprofits are a very rich part of the tapestry that is the American story. I'm going to focus on just a few strands of that heritage. Reform organizations devoted to the abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, and black civil rights, to illustrate how central nonprofits are to our history and thus to who we are. We'll look at the stories of 9 individuals, both famous and relatively unknown, who created or turned to nonprofits as a way to address the concerns of women Black Americans. These stories will show us the scope of what nonprofits do, the interconnection between the activities of various nonprofits, and the sometimes unexpected outcome of the efforts of nonprofits. Peter Williams Jr. was a free Black man born in New York City in 1786. How many people have heard of him? At that time, free Blacks in New York and Philadelphia began forming Black churches and schools to provide a space for the Black community to worship and learn, apart from the racism they were encountering in white institutions. Williams was educated at the African Free School, a nonprofit founded in 1787 by the New York Manumission Society, itself a nonprofit school that had educated several of New York's Black leaders. In 1813, Williams led a nonprofit association of Black Episcopalians that approached the Episcopal Diocesan Convention to allow a Black church and to ordain Black ministers. St. Philip's Church, that first Black church, was erected 6 years later, and Williams, upon becoming the second Black Episcopalian priest, served as its minister. Williams used his pulpit to preach anti-slavery messages. On Independence Day in 1830, he told his congregation, "No people in the world profess so high a respect for liberty and equality as the people of the United States, and yet no people hold so many slaves or make such great distinctions between man and man." His stance was more courageous than it might appear now. 4 years later, both his church and his home were almost destroyed by an anti-abolitionist mob. St. Philip's Church continues its ministry today in Harlem. Now, Williams was active in his community outside his church. He was a founding member of the American Anti-Slavery Society, which became one of the leading abolitionist organizations in the United States. And he co-founded Freedom's Journal, the first African-American newspaper in the United States. One of Williams' congregants was a woman named Isabella. Isabella was born a slave in the 1790s. Her parents were owned by a Dutch family in New York State. Her first language was Dutch. English was her second language. She was illiterate her entire life. Her parents had lost at least 8 of her older siblings who had been sold on the slave market as children. When she was 9 years old, she was taken from her family and sold to an English-speaking couple. Her childhood was marked by considerable physical abuse, in part because she couldn't understand English commands, and also sexual abuse. She freed herself in 1826, shortly before her freedom would have been required under New York's gradual emancipation law. She left because she heard the voice of God directing her to leave. Isabella went to New York City, where she joined Peter Williams Jr.'s church and found a larger community of reformers actively opposed to slavery and engaged in many of the reform movements of the day. In 1843, Isabella changed her name to Sojourner Truth. She dictated a widely circulated book about her experiences in slavery and participated in the American Anti-Slavery Society, which we just saw, giving many lectures around the North on ending slavery. The groundwork laid by Peter Williams Jr., Sojourner Truth, the American Anti-Slavery Society, and thousands of other individuals working in numerous nonprofit organizations eventually led to the emancipation of more than 4 million enslaved Americans in 1865, an accomplishment that was probably the most revolutionary action in our history. Now, Truth was also an early advocate for women's rights. She addressed the 1851 Ohio Women's Rights Convention, arguing that women should have rights as well as men. Jesus, she pointed out, came into the world through God and a woman who bore him. Man, she asked, where is your part? She was particularly active in women's rights organizations after the Civil War, traveling extensively, I heard a mother clap, traveling extensively to advance women's In 1872, she joined Susan B. Anthony and others in an effort to vote in the presidential election. As Sojourner Truth recognized, women of all backgrounds were pinched out of the political process in the 19th century. Like Sojourner Truth, many responded by becoming very active in voluntary associations of all types. Women worked in and ran a variety of charities aimed at moral improvement and helping the less fortunate. They founded women's clubs all over the country to bring women together to do good works. They also advocated for reforms that would improve the lives of families and children. They increasingly saw suffrage as key to enacting other reforms. In the latter part of the 19th century, one of the strategies employed by suffragettes was to change state suffrage laws while pushing forward the slow process of amending the U.S. Constitution. Susan B. Anthony, president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, worked tirelessly for suffrage for more than half a century. She was a fearless woman with a wry wit. In 1872, she and other women were arrested in Rochester for voting. Anthony refused to pay her streetcar fare to the police station because she was, quote, traveling under protest at the government's expense. Anthony took a long railroad trip to Oregon on 3 occasions to advocate for the vote for Oregon women. On her last visit in 1905, which was a year before her death, she and the National American Women's Suffrage Association worked with Oregonian Esther Pohl, later Esther Pohl Lovejoy, and other members of the Portland Women's Club, among others, on an unsuccessful suffrage campaign. Who's heard of Esther Pohl? Oh, somebody has. Esther Pohl was born in 1869 in a logging camp in Washington Territory to working class parents. She was a brilliant student who worked as a department store clerk to put herself through medical school. In 1907, she became the Portland City Health Officer, which she was the first woman in the U.S. to head the health bureau of a major city. Pohl was president of the Medical Club of Portland and a member of the Portland Women's Club and the Council of Jewish Women, all organizations that she counted on to support her health initiatives to protect children from disease, inspect milk, and provide safe drinking water. After numerous failures to pass suffrage, Pohl and other members of the Portland Women's Club changed the suffrage strategy. Previous campaigns had focused on quietly winning over wealthy and educated voters. In 1912, the Portland Women's Club built a grassroots coalition of groups across the state to support suffrage, 70 altogether and 47 outside of Portland. One member of the coalition was the Chinese American Equal Suffrage Society. In this photograph, we see members of the society who joined white suffragettes, including Pohl, for a suffragette luncheon, a public crossing of racial lines that was unheard of in Oregon in 1912. The coalition also included the Colored Women's Equal Suffrage Association, the Oregon State Grange, the Oregon Federation of Labor, and Everybody's Equal Suffrage League that Pohl started to represent wage-earning women. To be accessible to working women, Everybody's Equal Suffrage League charged 25 cents for a lifetime membership, something an AO's probably not going to want to do, instead of the customary several dollars a month, and made every member a vice president. It quickly attracted hundreds of enthusiastic vice presidents around the state who came up with some excellent organizing strategies. With strong support from the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the campaign was successful and Oregon women won the vote in 1912. As a result of the work of Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, Esther Pohl, and thousands of other individuals working in many nonprofits, the U.S. Constitution was amended in 1920 to give women the right to vote. So one of the sites where Sojourner Truth, there we are voting. One of the sites where Sojourner Truth spoke for women's rights in 1853 was the Broadway Tabernacle, a nonprofit congregational church in New York City. Church members there formed the American Missionary Association, which took a prominent role in abolishing slavery and promoting Black education and racial equality. After the Civil War, the AMA founded more than 500 schools and colleges for freed people in the South, including Fisk University. University in Nashville. One of the people educated at Fisk University was W.E.B. Du Bois. Who's heard of Du Bois? I suspect some people have. All right, good. Du Bois was the most prominent intellectual leader and political activist among African Americans in the first half of the 20th century. He was the first African American to earn a doctorate at Harvard. It was in history, yay. In 1909, he co-founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NDoubleACP, to combat lynching and to work for racial equality. For 25 years, Du Bois was the editor-in-chief of its publication, The Crisis. The organization grew rapidly and by 1919 had 90,000 members in more than 300 local branches. Most people credit its report on ending 30 years of lynching from 1889 to 1919 with drastically decreasing the incidence of lynching. During the 1930s and 40s, the NAACP successfully challenged a variety of segregationist practices in the courts. These victories paved the way for its chief counsel, Thurgood Marshall, to persuade the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn the separate but equal doctrine in the Brown school desegregation case in 1954. Marshall was later appointed to be the first black justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. A Portland chapter of the NAACP was founded in 1914 with Dr. J.N. Merriman as president and Beatrice Morrow Kennedy as first secretary. So who's heard of Kennedy? Ah, not so many people. Well, you should. Kennedy was born and went to college in Texas, taught briefly in Oklahoma, and studied music in Chicago. She came to Portland in 1912 to marry Edward Kennedy, who was the founder and editor of The Advocate, a black newspaper. She became assistant editor and later editor and owner of The Advocate. In 1922, she became the first African-American woman to graduate from law school in Portland, in Oregon, rather. After the establishment of the Portland NAACP in 1914, Kennedy, at age 25, quickly emerged as its most powerful voice. She headed the NAACP's protest against the showing of the racist film, The Birth of a Nation, and waged a 15-year campaign to limit the showing of that film. She successfully challenged the exclusion of black children from public schools in Longview, Washington, and Vernonia, Oregon. Kennedy was an elegant woman who hosted very popular Sunday afternoon interracial salons attended by black, white, Chinese, and Japanese guests. She was also a strong woman who was unafraid to speak her mind. In 1924, she wrote a scathing editorial response in The Advocate to a newspaper editor in Grants Pass who had written an article entitled Keeping Grants Pass White. Writing 6 years after the end of World War I, Kennedy castigated the editor by saying that the article is the child of a twisted and dwarfed brain, or the brain of a jackass who, you wouldn't be surprised, does not know the World War has ended. In her work with the NAACP, Kennedy and others wrapped up a 30-year battle by persuading Oregon voters in 1925 to repeal a state constitutional provision that excluded African Americans from living in Oregon, rarely enforced the highly offensive law, and in 1927 to repeal a state constitutional provision that prohibited black people from voting, also unenforceable because it had been overridden by the U.S. constitutional amendment, but highly offensive. Kennedy moved to Los Angeles in 1936, but the Portland NAACP continued its work against discrimination in Oregon. For more than 30 years, the NAACP, with assistance from numerous black ministers and other organizations, had attempted to persuade the legislature to ban discrimination in public accommodations, like we're seeing here. It was finally successful in 1953. The Black United Fund, one of your NAO members, is an heir to this tradition, as are we all. In other sections of the country, segregation laws remained in effect. Lillian Waycock Johnson, a Tennessee club woman and suffragette who was very active in promoting women's education in Tennessee, donated land in eastern Tennessee in the early 1930s to a new nonprofit called the Highlander Folk School. Highlander offered workshops for activists, initially in the labor movement and later in the civil rights movement. At the end of a weekend civil rights workshop in the mid-1950s, which Johnson herself attended, The trainer asked the group what their next steps were as they took back what they had learned to their communities. Sound familiar? One woman, a seamstress and NAACP member, who's seated here on the far right, answered that she didn't know what she was going to do next. She was thinking about it. 4 months later, she refused to yield her seat on a public bus to a white passenger. Her name is Rosa Parks. Parks' arrest for her refusal to give up her seat, as most of us know, triggered the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. Now, the boycott was called by the Women's Political Council, a nonprofit organization of professional African-American women in Montgomery. The night of Parks' arrest, the council mimeographed and over the next couple days distributed 35,000 flyers calling for a boycott the following Monday. For those of you who don't know what a mimeograph machine is, they work like this. On Monday, the buses coming out of the black section of town were empty. The boycott was subsequently successfully led by the Montgomery Improvement Association, a new nonprofit association of ministers and civil rights leaders, headed by a 26-year-old minister, Dr. Martin Luther King. Inspired by the success of the boycott, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also led by Dr. King, the NDoubleACP, and numerous other organizations spent 10 years exposing segregation. They persuaded Congress to enact federal civil rights legislation that protected the rights of all citizens, regardless of race, to use public accommodations, to vote, and to be employed. So, what Peter Williams Jr., Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, Esther Pohl, W.E.B. Du Bois, Beatrice Morrow Kennedy, Lillian Wyckoff Johnson, Rosa Parks, Dr. Martin Luther King, and many others teach us is the importance of nonprofit organizations in American life. We can draw several lessons from this very rich history. In U.S. culture, we place a great deal of emphasis on individualism, don't we? We admire the self-made person getting ahead in business, individual civil rights to speak, worship, and vote freely, and individuality in our styles and preferences. We consider rugged individualism to be virtuous. Individualism is often a good thing, but Americans' strong identification with individualism tends to obscure the critical ways that we are connected to one another and the tremendous importance of community. Our history of voluntary associations reveals to us this side of ourselves. Although we're not the only country in the world to have non-governmental organizations, we have an unusually strong tradition of reliance on nonprofits to connect us together so that we can enhance our world. And nonprofits have delivered in huge ways. Triggering the abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, and Black civil rights are only a few examples. In seeking to better our world, I'd also suggest we not only help our communities, but also nurture and improve part of ourselves. Our souls, as Sojourner Truth might tell us. Embedded in our nonprofit history is a second lesson. Not only do nonprofits benefit our world and ourselves, but our nonprofit heritage helps us to understand our interconnections with each other and the ways that the work of one organization might build on or support the work of another. Reform-minded churches spawned the American Missionary Association that founded the college that educated W.E.B. Du Bois, who co-founded the NAACP. And look what that organization did. After years of failing to achieve suffrage, the Portland Women's Club was successful when it put together a voluntary coalition that crossed racial and class lines. Rosa Parks was influenced both by her membership in the NAACP and by the Highlander workshop. The Women's Political Council initiated, and the Montgomery Improvement Association that successfully managed the boycott following her arrest. We apply these lessons today, don't we? When we talk about interdependence, coalitions, and collaboration. Parks' story also reminds us that we often have no idea how extensive the impact is of our work. The Highlander Center did not know when Parks left its workshop what she would do. Although we may see some of our short-term results, we often don't get to see the long-term consequences of our work. For example, when a child is nurtured by NAO member Janus Youth Programs, a woman is empowered by your member, Center Against Rape and Domestic Violence, or a man finds work after participating in job assistance programs provided by your member, Hacienda CDC. Your members perform these and many other services. Who knows the full extent of what all these services do for the people they touch and all those people touch? Look around the room. Really, look around this room. What would we see if we could somehow see the full, long-range impact of all that all of us do? Every person in this room is a part of this, our nonprofit tradition. Most of us were served by nonprofits as young people, through our churches, scouts, youth sports, scholarships, and many other ways. Today, we participate in giving back, serving on nonprofit boards, working for a nonprofit, or volunteering for and donating to nonprofits. Every person in this room is also part of an important new development in the nonprofit world. Until about 30 years ago, there was virtually no recognition of the nonprofit sector as a distinct segment in American public life. In the early 1980s, scholars began to identify the nonprofit world as a separate sector of the community, generally positioning it alongside government and business as the three sectors of society. As the nonprofit sector has developed an institutional structure, it has, especially in the last 7 years, taken a new step forward. Business has always had strong advocates for its interests: National Association of Manufacturers, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, many powerful business leagues. Until recently, the nonprofit sector had no real public voice. The sector is developing some national advocacy presence with nonprofits like Council on Foundation and Independent Sector. You today are part of building a new chapter in Oregon nonprofit history by participating in the Nonprofit Association of Oregon. I'm personally delighted to see NAO become our advocacy voice for Oregon nonprofits. We need one. I've told only a very small part of the nonprofit story today, but I hope it's opened a portal into a new understanding of who we are as Americans. What we name and claim as our identity influences how we act and how others respond to us and act. The next time someone asks you what you're proud of about being an American, remember the work that so many who have come before us have done and the work that we do. We Americans are a people that care about our communities and our world, and our nonprofit heritage is our proof. Join me in claiming this as part of our American identity. And thank you for all that you do to make it so.